So I'd like to welcome the panel to the stage. It's going to be moderated by Tim Ehrlich, who's a partner from Gunderson Dettmer over in Boston, to explore some of those themes. Not brave. Just to say that it's a pretty packed program. So, you know, if we have time, we'll come for audience questions, but then there is the networking after to follow up on if we don't get time to get to. But if you do get to questions, there is a roving mic, which my colleagues will be happy to bring to you. So if you put your hand up and you get singled out, do wait for the mic to arrive. But over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name's Tim Ehrlich. I'm a partner at Gunderson Dettmer. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not from the UK. I'm from a little town called Boston, Massachusetts. And I am a partner in our corporate group. I oversee our life science practice on a national basis. My perspective on emerging growth companies and venture capital is shaped by my firm's dedication over the last 30 years to the emerging company and venture capital space. We're unique in the law firm world in the US in that we're entirely focused on corporate and transactional work for venture capital and growth equity firms and also emerging growth companies. So we work with about 450 different venture capital and high growth equity firms, helping them do fund formation and investor side work. And then at any point in time, about 3,500 different companies from very, very early stage to late stage public and private. So just to echo something that David had said, in terms of capital being raised and available, we see that firsthand. Just as a side note, I guess before we get going on the panel, that we work with a lot of these funds, emerging managers, new funds, established funds, and there is in fact billions of dollars of venture capital and growth equity funds that are available or have been raised over the last several years, and hopefully will be deployed in the coming years. So with that intro, I thought we're going to talk about managing our Maisonette. We've got an incredible panel of folks here who have very different perspectives and experiences working in the UK life sciences sector. And I thought maybe we'd get started with each of you going down and telling a little bit about your background, just so the folks get a sense of, what perspective you bring to this question of managing our Maisonette. So maybe you want to start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Tony Hickson. I'm the Chief Business Officer at Cancer Research UK and Cancer Research Horizons. Cancer Research Horizons is the innovation engine of the charity. Our job is to help get the ideas out of the universities that we're funding and out there into the hands of investors and industry to move them towards products and services that will help patients. So we're very much at the early end of that innovation spectrum, and that's the role I'll be playing today.
Good morning. My name is Eric Mays. I'm the CEO of Endomag. We're a UCL spin-out that sold to Hologic in July of this year. So we grew what was a sort of single-person startup into 160 people, having treated over 500,000 patients around 45 countries around the world, and sold for $310 million to Hologic, an $18 billion market cap company in July. So bringing the sort of exited UK company in a tough market perspective.
George Freeman, former Minister for Life Science in recovery from 14 years on the front line of government. I think I'm going into my third career, really, 15 years of venture hustle in the early life science sector in the 90s. 14 years on and off the front bench, leading the life science program here in the coalition, and now advising various companies, funds, and one foot in public realm. I'm back in Parliament. I'm Deputy Chair of the Science and Tech Select Committee and trying to be a constructive force as this new government tries to take life science ecosystem to the next stage. And I think there's some quite interesting opportunities here in the UK in light of that.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sarah Haywood. I'm the Managing Director of a business leadership group in Oxfordshire called Advanced Oxford. We connect and convene the science and technology community across the region and beyond. Not just life sciences, I should say, but all science and technology-driven businesses across the region. Previously, I've worked in the NHS, in the pharma industry, and as a policymaker in government, including on life sciences. And I also have run a life sciences-focused angel group.
Good morning, everyone. I'm David Stubbs, as you know, from my speech a minute ago, and I'm an investment banker who's been working in the life sciences sector for 25 years. The first 20 of those years were spent in the U.S., primarily in New York and also in San Francisco. And then the last 5 years have been spent working out of the London office of Raymond James, where I run the healthcare investment banking business and have covered the life sciences sector there and will continue to do so.
Excellent. So I want to start by saying that the title of this panel is Manchester Maisonette. It's a question that presumes an answer, which I think maybe gets a little bit ahead of the it assumes a conclusion. And I think the first question really that I have is, what is, if we're trying to get somewhere, that means we're not there now, and that the UK hasn't quite fully realized its full potential in becoming a life sciences epicenter. So why do you think that is, right? What is the main thing that has been holding it back, or things that you think has created the situation that you're in right now, where it's prevented it or limited the ability to realize that full benefit, the full potential? Anyone want to start? Tony, why don't you go? Tony, what do you think?
Well, I mean, there's lots of things in there, aren't there? There's culture. So I remember there was a quote, I think it was from Hal Barron, the ex-R&D head at GSK, and I'm pretty sure he said something like, the UK, London has everything that Boston has except the culture. So I think that's certainly an area that I've seen improving in terms of trying to make things better. We're seeing at the starts of now a cultural change, I think, from academia and entrepreneurship. We're certainly seeing many more young entrepreneurs coming through who want new startups, who do care about impact and innovation. And so I think that's really good. But of course, it's not just culture. We also need the capital, and that I certainly believe that if we can resolve the capital issue, a lot of these other barriers we're probably going to talk about today will self-resolve themselves. We tend to have a focus on the barriers. It's a bit like the analogy would be, we keep focusing on trying to remove the chocks from the wheel of the aeroplane rather than putting the fuel in the aeroplane to get it to take off. So there's certainly that. And then of course there's at the far end of the chain, there's the whole pull cycle, the procurement. We have this amazing NHS. We want to get things into it, yet our ability to procure new ideas and then to adopt them in our healthcare system still doesn't work properly. So yeah, quite a few things still need fixing.
Maybe Sarah, as you said, you've had a large data set to pull from your different careers and current and past. What do you think about that?
For me, I think there are two key challenges that we're facing at the moment. And in a sense, the data that we saw to introduce this panel was incredibly helpful in demonstrating that we're in a bit of a lean period at the moment, and certainly have been for a little while. And I think that's, first of all, having a really significant impact on early stage companies, and companies getting their first money or earlier stages of money. It's always quite interesting, actually, when you see data that talks about Series A, because it's one of those, how long is a piece of string? For some people, Series A could be $1 million, and for others 70. And obviously, if that's the median, then there are others who are getting substantially more than that. I mentioned that I have quite a bit of experience in terms of working with angel investors, and certainly one of the things that we're seeing at the moment is that there's a retrenchment on the part of angels. They're becoming much more risk averse. They're much more likely to be going for revenue generating companies. And as a consequence, that means they're shying away from the riskier investments. And clearly, if you're starting a life sciences company, regardless of the modality and the subsectors that we heard about, you need money, and you need patient money, and you need it for the long term. And if you can't secure that first support, it's really, really difficult to get going. So I think, there's more I could say, but I think that's a really significant issue that we're seeing at the moment. And then, of course, we're also reflecting in this panel around some of the reforms that are are being taken forward that were started under the previous government and are being driven forward now, which are really about generating the much more substantial pools of private capital that we need for companies to scale. So, of course, it's one thing to get them going, but they need quite substantial pools of capital to be able to move through the R&D cycle. Issues at both points.
So, George, I know I have a great question for you, which is all about the government and what role they should play. But do you want to speak to this point first, in terms of challenges?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, because if we're clear what's been holding us back, then I think we can be clearer going forward. And I think there are three big things I'd highlight. There is a cultural thing. Certainly, the sector when I joined it in the 90s, we were basically tailgating the US boom, biotech boom. And it felt to me like a sector that had worked out that you could raise money, you could run funds, you could make fees, you could sell on. But I think we're completely different now. The UK life science sector is much more mature. It's building companies with real value, and it's very good at selling them strategically into the industry. I think we punch well above our weight on smart trade deals. And I think the Brits, the maturity of the leaders, the management, the investors is unrecognisable from those days. The two I'd highlight really are the NHS. Wes Streeting has done us all a favour, so I'm going to pile in and support him. It is not a brilliant healthcare system. And it is not working well for its patients, for its medics, or for the life science industry. And I was very polite about it when I was Minister for Life Science. And David Cameron allowed me to go in as Minister for Life Science in the Department of Business and Health. And I think Wes Streeting has begun to realise that unless he profoundly changes the model, which I think he's going to do, and I'm right behind him, it will preside over just pouring more and more money into bureaucracy and less coming out in innovative treatments on the front line. That has been a major barrier. And the third one is the capital markets in the city. And I've actually spent more time since the election in the city than in Parliament, really, to try and get to the bottom of the Mansion House piece. What's been really shocking to me is I thought the challenge was, how do you connect a maturing, grown-up UK life science ecosystem, venture ecosystem, with the city? And it's beginning to repair, but I'm really struck by how hollowed out the city's become in the last 20 years. The indexation, the globalization, the allocation globally. Just to give you the number, in 97, and it went on to 99, or 50-odd% of the UK 3 trillion pension pot was invested in the UK. It's now 3.7. So actually, I think what we're going to have to do here is help the city, and there are some real leaders in the city who want to do this. And again, I support Rachel Reeves on it. They're ready now to begin to deploy. And we've got some great investors, venture investors. There's about 10 in this country who are doing really quality stuff. And we've got some brilliant companies lined up on the runway. So I think we're at an inflection point. The market's always boom and bust, but I think we could be focused on building some really powerful companies in a global market for trade exits, give the city some returns, and start to build an ecosystem here that is sustainable.
So, two questions that come out of that, and David and Eric, I want to ask these of you. David, you clearly love data, and Eric, you've been through an exit and what would be deemed, a successful outcome for companies, and you both worked in other places besides the UK and are now doing life sciences here. I want to ask this question of everyone, but start with the two of you, which is, again, we started from the principle of it's a question, which one is achievable, Mansion or Maisonette, what should be built? We're not there yet. We've talked about some of the things that are lacking. How will success be defined? How do you, if we're talking about a Mansion or Maisonette or whatever term you want to use, you have to know what success looks like in order to work towards it, have those goals. And it's easy to talk about, capital, companies, success, et cetera, but ultimately it's going to come down to what is it? What is the data? What are the metrics that will be used to define, if we set a goal, what are those goals and have they been achieved or not? Because you need, it's just natural human nature. It's like, we want to do this, what is it? And how do we prove that we've achieved it for everyone? Whether it's investors, government officials, investment bankers, et cetera. What do you think would be the criteria for what success looks like here? It's not an easy question, but I'm curious your thoughts.
It brings to mind, there was an article by Ian Hogarth in the Financial Times over the weekend talking about, what is holding the UK back from its first, $1 trillion company, and reflected a lot on that. And I think the main thesis thesis was serial exited entrepreneurs putting back into the ecosystem, and I think that's something that that has been a challenge in the UK, in forming the foundations of the ecosystem. Are people basically moving to the U.S. because that's where the opportunity is, or taking their company with them when it's acquired. I think now you're seeing a lot more of that talent being retained, and people sort of going on their second or third or fourth careers back in life science companies. I think there's another thing that I would subtle point on the also with an American accent here, talking about the nature of the UK. One of the things that struck me when I first came here wasn't the lack of science capability. It was actually, I thought, much more superior to the US. I think there are reasons for that, but culturally, I think it was superior from a life science research drive. But the area that was more challenged was the sort of entrepreneurial drive. I think that's also changing because people see the successes that are coming through and see that could be a lifestyle change for them. There was actually a poll at UCL recently that asked a lot of the people coming to these events in entrepreneurship to say, what are you interested in your career? And they said it's transitioning to becoming an entrepreneur rather than necessarily being a researcher. So people see that as an opportunity, see evidence of that. So I think what does success look like over time? Maybe it is that $1 trillion company valuation, but I think it's just a much stronger ecosystem, and the number of exit entrepreneurs continuing on in the UK, continue to build the ecosystem.
David, what about you?
Yeah, I'd actually add to that. I agree with that, and I think a lot of it is that the successful entrepreneurs, but also the successful companies, stay here, right? And the days are gone of it used to be so. Predominantly, the NASDAQ has been the best place to raise capital in the world for life sciences companies, and that probably won't change going forward. But what used to be, kind of policy was that if you didn't have a beachhead or an establishment in the U.S., you weren't going to go public on the NASDAQ. That's completely changed. So what you're seeing is there's no reason for UK companies to leave the UK to access whatever market they want to access globally. And I think a big part of what could drive that to happen is the integration of capital and early stage capital and risk capital in the UK into these companies so they can grow and mature and they can be fostered here to get to the point where then they need to access substantial capital, which might be going to the NASDAQ, but going to the NASDAQ doesn't necessarily mean that they have to move to the US. It means that they could have the jobs in the UK. It means they could have their company remain in the UK. And if you look at Boston, for example, everyone likes to use Boston compared to, Boston is built on the story of a lot of successful life sciences company whose technology came from Boston. The companies raised money in Boston, and then they stayed in Boston and grew in Boston. So that's been the history. And I think if you could replicate that in the UK, which you certainly could, even if the large capital in the public markets is raised outside of the UK, you could have a much larger ecosystem, and then you retain the most important part of it, which I think is the personal capital, right? You have to have the people remain at home to grow the industry in a certain community.
Yeah, so it's interesting as you were talking about that. There's certain things that we take or I take for granted living in Boston, and it's exactly the kinds of things that you're talking about, which is there's this ecosystem of people. Like when you refer to so-and-so, like, oh yeah, they were at Millennium, which sold to so-and-so and then created Third Rock, and then they crushed it, and then they retired, and so there's this turning over, this constant turning over. You identify the entrepreneurs that are successful in that market and who are still there. Or my office is next to Vertex, right? Huge success story, built around technology from there. They moved to the Seaport in Boston, which was basically a parking lot. And built the first real biotech, huge establishment in the Seaport, and now they've been hugely successful. They've stayed there. They've had opportunities to leave and everything. So I think that's a good point. It's like having things to point to that are, and more than a few at a little, because it's very hard to measure these things, right? You could talk about dollars invested on PitchBook, number of companies funded, number of exits. Those are all relevant, but some of it is just sort of, can you point to repeat entrepreneurs? Can you point to companies that are success stories that are in the environment? Capital, obviously, I want to get back to capital because hugely important. Everyone admits it. There's various forms of capital. When people talk about it, it's easy to say we need more capital, but we all know there's lots of different forms at critical stages that can play a huge role in making a company successful or not. So George, I want to start with you. What role should the government, should the UK government and its various forms play in the capital gap that UK companies face right now?
Brilliant, thank you. So the two questions go together really, because it's a big public policy issue, right? I get it. For a government to mandate that our pension industry must invest in the UK is a big call. And I totally respect that the pension fund managers are looking, going, hang on, there's a whole world out there. Our job is to look after our pensioners and their returns, and we know what we're doing and we know how to invest globally. So it is a very delicate issue, and I think being clear what we want to achieve is the key. And for me, that would be one, just take that number. If we're at 3.7% allocation in the UK, over 10 years, I would say, surely we should get that up to 10% in the UK and 5% in private, or 15 and 5. I don't know, but I mean, I'm not talking 50, 60%, but just let's set a number. Secondly, I think we need to show the pension funds that we will deliver real cash bottom line returns. So we need to show them as a sector that we can pull big trade deals, and we're not selling them NASDAQ promises for tomorrow to begin with. We're building confidence that, wow, this sector delivers returns. And the data that's going to come out in January from the British Business Bank and the BIA is very interesting. It nails the myth that the life science sector is slow, high risk, and doesn't return. Not true. It absolutely does. Thirdly, I think we need to then make sure that our big investors who are building scalable companies can access that capital and build companies. Build Adaptimmune, Immunotech, build companies here. And then, crucially, I think then we start to build an IPO market here again. But I think it's a myth to think we can suddenly fuel a big NASDAQ IPO market here. We've got to earn the right to show the city. So on the mandate question, Emma Reynolds, who's the city minister, is, I think, very good. We're very lucky. We have a very highly respected minister in that field. And my message to her is, look, I would support you on mandating that we've got to do this, but don't mandate how. Let the market co-create. You're already seeing, so Nick Lyons at Phoenix with Schroders is allocating. First money's been allocated, 150 million to 3 investors. These are drips of money, but they'll become quite big. That market is happening, and I think it should be a market. And as Kate Bingham and Alan Marchington and Pete Davis and the big funds here start to talk to the city, I think we'll see some co-created. So I'd mandate that it must happen, a realistic set of numbers and a time frame, but don't mandate how. And I think we could start to see some really big capital beginning to flow into our clusters as well, for infrastructure and property, as well as for scale up. Because if you scale up companies, they have a bigger footprint, they have a bigger demand for space and all of that. So it's a big growth agenda. So I support the mandating. Emma tells me I'm the only Conservative MP who's prepared to say that yet.
When I think of these like mandates and pension reforms, I think of big dollars. But Sarah, you talked and you also been involved with we're talking early stage companies that need $100,000, $500,000, $1 million. What role can and should the governments play in addressing that funding gap?
Shall I come in first on that? So can I just say I completely agree with what George is saying, and we can't mandate how we absolutely shouldn't. I think we need to be a little bit cautious as well about kind of mandating percentages. I mean, I think there's a lot to be learned from, for instance, the Women on Boards big debate to sort of 10, 15 years ago, which is, do you have targets? Do you have quotas? So I think I think being very clear about what we want to see and creating the environments to do that, and certainly the bringing together. I mean, we've got an extremely fragmented pensions environment in the UK, which is one of the challenges. So pooling that risk is really important. So just to build a little bit on some of the things that George has said, I mean, in terms of that early stage, it's a trickle-down system that we're operating in, isn't it? So clearly, institutions like the one that Tony is part of are incredibly important. I think we've been really fantastically fortunate in the last few years that we've seen a number of our universities, so UCL obviously has already been mentioned, really professionalising themselves in terms of thinking about how they support spin-outs, in terms of how they create relationships with money so that they can support those companies. And because I'm working in Oxford, obviously the relationship between the University of Oxford and Oxford Science Enterprises is a fantastic example of that. One of the things that Advanced Oxford is really advocating for is to make sure that we don't forget that companies come from many different sources and not just from universities. And that's very much part of this issue about recycling, because we get lots and lots of companies that come through serial entrepreneurialism, come as spin-outs from companies themselves, and we need to make sure that we've got a level playing field, and we really don't at the moment. So we've just done a really extensive piece of work looking at private capital raising in Oxfordshire over the last decade. Again, not just for life sciences, but the issues are the same, whether you're an advanced manufacturing company, future of autonomy and automotive, etc. If you are operating as a university spin-out in one of our top-tier universities, you are fantastically supported by tech transfer professionals. You've got preferential access to relationships and money through the relationships that they have, through Park Walk, IP Group, all working together now, etc. If you are not part of that ecosystem, you're on your own. And so what I would really like to see is a much greater recognition of the fact that we need to provide much more support into that earlier stage funding. So I'd really like to see British Business Bank doing more angel co-investment type of funds that will come in and encourage angels to go into sectors, again, like life sciences. And alongside that, really good quality support for companies that doesn't necessarily need to come from government, but if we can try and encourage companies like yours to come and work and make themselves available to companies to provide advice and guidance, we can really get companies working well. Because one of the things that we really see at the moment, we've known for a very long time that we've got big challenges in the UK around leadership, management skills, investment into those. There are lots of reasons why those don't happen. So some of the reforms around things like apprenticeship levy and allowing much greater flexibility in terms of how that can be used to support skills development in companies and get them onto a really strong footing early on, I think are some of the things I would like to see as well.
Excellent. Tony?
Yeah, I mean, just a quick word on scale up, because I think it is really important, and there will be a trickle down to the early stage world that we sort of inhabit if we get that right. But I do worry about whether mandating is going to work versus some sort of credit inducement from the government, some first loss or guarantee, but that's a bigger debate. So in the world of the early stage, there is another gap. So as well as the scale-up gap, we have the gap of just getting those very first experiments done in the university to validate them, to de-risk them to the point that venture capital will engage. And there is still a gap there. And that gap can only really be filled by government or charities or foundations or philanthropy, because no investors are acting rationally. It's too risky. They're not going to invest in that space. So we've seen a £40 million commitment by the government over the next 5 years into space. That is very welcome. We're not ungrateful. But in terms of quantum, if we just scale that, the need across the UK sector is about 600 million. and this has been calculated. If you look at Holland, they have an 11 billion euro fund. They've just put 600 million into a single drug discovery scheme to plug that early stage gap. If you look at a single region of Belgium, Flanders region, they have 5 times the amount of proof of concept capital that we have in the UK. There is a huge gap in this early stage, and we are leaving sort of good ideas on the table unless we also plug that gap.
You know, maybe one thing I would add to that is where this problem has been solved also, and in early stage I agree is the key, right? But where this problem has been solved in Boston is that actually not through the public sector, but the private sector, where literally at MIT you have venture capitalists crawling around the labs, meeting with all of the people who are working on the bench to see what they're working on and providing capital. And actually the hottest area of venture capital investment in the US with the best returns has actually been company formation, where they're actually taking someone straight out of the university lab, providing them capital, and then providing a facility to grow their business. And that's provided the best returns for venture capital in the US, bar none. So Third Rock, Atlas, those types of firms in Boston. So I would argue that also along with the public sector intervention, finding a way to partner with these great educational institutions you have in the UK, finding a way for them to partner with the private sector as well, so you can get them engaged in looking at these great technologies earlier, just like they do in Boston. I mean, it's a joke in Boston when you talk to scientists. They're saying they have 3 venture capitalists visit them a day, right? And when they're at the university trying to get their PhD done, right? If you could have some semblance of that here, you also help to solve that problem through the private sector as well.
Yeah, so and I live that existence every day, and it is absolutely true. In fact, there's a company now called, or a venture fund hybrid called CuriBio that has now taken to advertising on the highway to encourage postdocs to leave their lab and bring their ideas to them as a new model. They're going even further upstream, but the highway billboard was really a new one for me. So speaking of highways and infrastructure, because I have an interesting story about the sort of some of the acceleration of development and creation of companies in Boston and Cambridge in particular. A lot of that can be traced back to a thing called Lab Central, which was actually, prior to that, was something called Cambridge Biolabs. Because even when you have early stage science, a lot of it is institutional science. It's done for research purposes. It's not really done with the intention of commercializing it. And one of the things that accelerated, in those days, you'd have venture capitalists coming in and saying, yeah, this is great science, but I want you to prove it to me that it works outside the lab. But institutions and researchers didn't have that capability. So a company called Cambridge Biolabs was created. It was basically a row of benches with shared equipment that allowed venture capitalists essentially to pay for a bench, to rent a bench for these scientists to leave their institutions, come and replicate their science in the outside world, which then sort of justified the investment. And that led to the creation of Lab Central, which is a combination of MIT providing space, Mass Life Sciences Council in Massachusetts giving $1 million grant to build out the infrastructure, which allowed individuals basically to create a company on a credit card, because you could rent a bench, 6 feet of bench, for $6,000 a month and get access to all of the services, the shared services. And then that had lab space, it had equipment, central buying authority. You could buy everything there that you needed, all the reagents, all the supplies. And then that brought all the venture capitalists to one place and all the pharma companies who wanted to be there. And sort of instead of having to go to each individual lab at MIT or Harvard, everyone was in one place. And it really unlocked an enormous amount of innovation. And that's now been replicated by Alexandria Life Labs, and all these different real estate groups are creating these things. George, you mentioned infrastructure. So let's talk about infrastructure in the UK. Does the folks here think that there are things in infrastructure that are holding you back? And if so, what are they, and how do we fix them?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I mean, very briefly, in the growth zones like Cambridge and probably coming soon in Oxford, it's just a sheer constraint of land prices, expansion space. And, the government's gripping it in Cambridge and trying to force some planning. But in the end, this sector's got to breathe and it's got to grow out. And if we do scale up in the city and Mansion House, then we've got to allow that breathing space. And I think there's a couple of technological points as well, I notice. I think there's 2 things going on around the sector on infrastructure. One is the deep tech biological fusion. It's quite extraordinary what what you're beginning to see, and I think we're going to have to think about new, science parks can't just be car parks with fume hoods. We're going to need to build really sophisticated data cloud systems, data centers, integrated research, and a whole new, it's not like Super Janet, so you can get the academic papers. It's going to be really complex, deep bio, and Cambridge is doing some pretty good work on that, I think. And the other end, the biologics revolution means, it's not just small molecules, powders and pills. That becomes quite sophisticated, which is why I was so keen to put more money into our advanced manufacturing piece. If you look at Exmoor Pharma, Ian Rhodes' company down in Bristol doing contract manufacturing for the biologics piece. So I think government needs to be thinking about those two new sort of butterfly wings, because if we can seed that, de-risk it, a lot of the American property was subsidized, right?
Yeah.
I think government has a role to help support those key infrastructure platforms that the private sector can crowd in on.
Yeah. So in terms of lab space, because we can talk about roads, we can talk about innovation, and we talked about this a little bit the other day when we were preparing for this in terms of the availability of lab space. Is there opportunities? Is it easy for researchers to leave the institution and go and set up a company in the UK? And if you don't have that, why do you think that is? Why isn't that here?
Well, so we've starting was relatively easy, but once we got to needing 1,000 square feet or up to 5,000 square feet, there was nothing, and we were fighting out with tons of companies. And once we went beyond 5,000 square feet, we were competing against Apple, Amazon, within Cambridge. And so the need for space, even general purpose space, is at a premium. But I think there are a couple of call-outs that might be useful. So Barclays had done something called Eagle Labs, which they created these incubator spaces. It wasn't for the life sciences industry, but at least they took this private initiative to create a space for entrepreneurs to grow businesses and to be a little community together and ensure that. So I think there have been a number of private initiatives in terms of property for the early stage. I think that's changing quite a bit now.
Some interesting deals. Look at, Bruntwood, yes, Gritstone, but I noticed Pioneer have just signed a big deal with Crown Estates. I think there's some quite big money now beginning to deploy into expansion property, which is an asset class of its own right. I mean, if you had a pension, you wouldn't want it all to be in one biotech company. You'd want it to be in property, in the growth space. So I think it's coming.
Actually, yesterday, I had something through the post in the door that said there was basically a notification of what was happening in the neighborhood. It said a MedTech center was going to be open. Now, a MedTech center? This is right next to me. It turned out when I went to their website, it was a typo. It was a mid-tech center. But I think it could easily be MedTech. And just the fact that they were focusing on creating space for local companies to grow in basically brown zone sites brownfield sites was interesting.
Can I jump in? So I think this is incredibly important, and we really in the UK we've been lagging behind in terms of creating the right kind of places, and I think it's really important that we, as George says, that we don't just think about these being car parks with fume hoods in. It's really essential that we wrap the right kind of services and amenities around this. And I think we're starting to see that. So I think we're starting to see much greater levels of sophistication in terms of the investors and developers around creating places that companies can grow and scale and have the support that they need to do so. And certainly there's an enormous amount of money that's flowing into Oxford and Oxfordshire to support development of life sciences and other sectors. But we also need to make sure that we get the essential investment into the infrastructure that we need to support flow of labour markets, etc., talent, people, housing, of course. So there's all of those other things. We were really delighted to see the continued commitment to East-West Rail in the budget recently. That is absolutely essential. It's absolutely crazy for UK PLC to think that it's almost impossible for people to get from Cambridge to Oxford and back again, and the areas in between. without going through an incredibly tortuous journey. I mean, it should be, you know, our US colleagues here at UTIM will think that's absolutely insane that people in Cambridge won't look at jobs in Oxford and vice versa, just because it's so incredibly difficult to get between the two. It's 70 miles.
Yeah. So, you know, we could talk about this all day, and certainly, I mean, getting into and out of Cambridge and Boston is not easy. So if anyone has ever done it, I would not say we've not cracked that code yet. But as we look to wrap up, I wanted to ask one last question and have the panelists, each of you, give your own perspective. You've obviously had long careers. Each of you have lived in different places around the world. You're in Europe. You're here in the UK. You look around you, not just focusing inward, but outward. What things have you seen? What lessons have you learned from watching what other countries have done? You know, Tony, you talked about this a little bit in terms of the funding and so forth. What lessons have you seen from other countries, whether it be the US or other countries in Europe or in Asia, that are lessons that you think should be brought to bear here in the UK, that you've seen be successful, that you would want to kind of impart to the next generation of leaders that are lessons learned?
But I guess the one I'd start with is a long-term, sustainable, stable sort of thing. So where it doesn't work is switching in and out of different schemes all the time, and scientists never quite knowing what to go to and not having any stability. The example you mentioned of the university tech transfer offices are now so much better than they used to be. I'm not saying they're perfect, but they're certainly much better. And all of the recent reviews, and there's been many, have shown that the UK tech transfer community is at least equal to the US tech transfer community when adjusted for research power and size. The reason for that is the government. The government invested long-term in those tech transfer offices over a 20-year period of stable investment, and that allowed that capability to be built. And I think we need the same in these other areas. We need that long-term stability to really be able to plan over the long term.
Eric, I mean.
Yeah, I agreed with that. I think, you know, given that I came over as a student, my original focus was to do my PhD and go back to the US, but I was so enamored with the quality of the science and research base here that I decided to stay and build my career and have lived the majority of my life here. So I think that's one of the attractions. One of the things that helped Endomag scale and exit, and the thing that I encourage people to do, is look at the US market. So often UK companies, they want to start with the NHS, which is a tough nut to crack, or just focus on the UK market, when the uniformity of the US market and the scale of it really helps to de-risk, and it helps with the scaling of an organization. There's a lot of attrition out there for companies that have tried to do that and failed, but I think there's a lot more learning now, and also groups like the ABHI have a footprint initiative to help smaller medtech companies go out and learn how to access the US market. So I think there's a shift to having UK companies look at the US market, and as David said, don't necessarily need to relocate to the US to be able to grow properly.
Yeah. Sure.
I'd echo both those points. Really well made. And my aim back in the coalition was to give us some stability, a 10-year program, and I support this government in building on that and doing it again. I'm going to be a bit controversial. I'm going to pick France. So, you know, we're not the US, we're not China, we're a Western European country. And I look at France, and for all the short-term political chaos, which France loves, right? I mean, the truth is that Macron, he looked at Brexit and he decided, okay, I'm going to whip you guys. I'm going to get my entrepreneurs back. I'm going to invest heavily in life science. I'm going to set up the Tibby scheme. I'm going to use the Élysée Palace to convene French capital for French growth and French business. And it just pains me to see, we used to be really good in this country at being global Brits, hustling, having a vision. You know, I'm a conservative, but I'm a sort of Heseltinian conservative. I think we have a big role to play in the world, and we've been a bit timid. So I would like us to be a bit more French about it, and to say, you know, not that we're gonna put all of our pensions in a few biotechs. I mean, that would be terrifying, right? But really, we can't put 10% of our own pension money, our money, in our companies to back our growth and our infrastructure. We can't convene and use government to get people in and say, come on, guys, we've been feeding NASDAQ and the Australian and Canadian pension system for too long. Come on. Let's back our entrepreneurs. They're good enough. These companies are good enough. Let's have some confidence.
Love
So that would be mine.
So I would say I would really like to see a shift in behaviour, if I can say. of both our entrepreneurs and also our investors to be much bolder and braver in terms of going and asking for more money, and giving themselves a longer runway. So I think one of the things that we've got into is a sort of a hamster wheel environment at the moment, where if you are running a company, you raise just about enough money to get you to the next milestone. And as soon as you've closed that deal, you're back on the hamster wheel, running to try and secure the next set. How can you be leading and running a company if what you're actually doing is constantly out raising money? So we really need to see a reset on both sides. So I don't know where I'm looking to in terms of that boldness and ambition, but I think I think we need to get a bit of ambition and be much braver.
Do you want to close off?
Sure. I guess I would just say, maybe back a little bit to the capital side, and you asked geographically what we've seen that's been successful. And I'd actually argue, we talk a lot globally here today and also comparing the UK to the US. I'd actually say an interesting phenomenon has happened even within the US. So when I started 25 years ago, you could argue that California and Boston were the same in terms of the amount of venture capital, the amount of corporations, the amount of success. I'd say today it's 70-30 Boston, California. So what's happened? There's $1 trillion in venture capital in California. So that's not the answer, right? It's clearly not just that there's capital there. It's how is the capital being deployed? How is it integrated in the community? And I'd say the difference of what's happened and why Boston has been so successful, which could be replicated to some degree in the UK, is that the deployment of capital in Boston has been at the early stages, and what we've been talking here as a panel, and helping entrepreneurs go from great university science into early stage science, and then take that through proof of concept. And if you have a steady stream of capital that's willing to do that, and that was a differentiation between Boston and California. California was focused on later stage. They actually ended up being more focused on tech, but historically they were similar to Boston. If you look at how they've parted ways, that's made Boston a much more powerful centerpiece in biotech in the US. And so it's once a company gets to proof of concept, whether that be animal data, depending upon the sector, whether it be phase 1, phase 2, the capital will come. I mean, there are companies in the UK that are funded out of Cambridge and Oxford that are going to successfully do $500 million private rounds this year. It's not a matter of getting capital for the winners. It's a matter of having a consistent flow of capital for the early stage entrepreneurs to get them from the bench in the university to proof of concept.
Excellent. All right. So with that, we will wrap up. I want to thank all of our panelists. It was really wonderful. Thank you.
And thank you, Tim. Just as the panel is exiting, as it were, and thanks for their insights. Well, I must be the shortest person up here today. Just before we head into coffee, we put the theme agenda about maximising the value out of our innovation and for all stakeholders. And we all know, and this room is full of people who collaborate every day to make that happen. So I'm just going to have 5 minutes from Antima Gupta from CDD, who are outside, just as a heads up about why you should talk to them today and how they can facilitate that collaboration.
Okay, hello everyone. So I would like to just focus on your data set, how you can get the maximum output out of it. So what is collaborative drug discovery? It's a platform cloud-based system which you can actually use to arrange your data, and then it helps you to basically scale up as well and set up your own database based on your own business rules. There are some set of the core molecule, the modules at the CDD vault, like activity and registration, maybe some ELN, some inventory, visualization to analyze your data, etc. But if you don't find anything which we have at the platform, you can still connect to the other system because it connects as a core module, core system, core facility in your lab. So what it does, we have our own chemistry engine, which helps you to draw and register the chemical entities. The panelists were talking about expanding your research not around only the small molecule, but you can also develop some or developing maybe some biologicals. So system does allow you to register those biological entities, whether the DNA sequence is coming or amino acid sequence, maybe a .dna file to render the plasmid. But in fact, you can also register the double-stranded, single-stranded RNA, DNA, protein antibodies as well. So that's our new capability, and we call it macromolecule editing tool. We also have this mixture tool, which our research informatics team developed. It helps you to set up some formulations, whether you are mixing the chemical or biological entity or maybe mix and match. So system does allow you to register those entities. Once you register those entities, then of course you have some biological data around those entities, and you can actually arrange that in the database. Database also helps you to draw these kind of plots, like the bell-shaped plot or the dose response plot using your raw data. So we have our own algorithm and they plot it for you, and you can also search whether the data is around the chemical or biological entity. Now this is, let me just see if it works. Yes, another module which we have is the inventory. We have the sample inventory where you can track the location as well as the quantity of any registered entity. If you have the samples which have multiple aliquots, you can set up the debit or credit, and everything is recorded in real time. You can actually share your data with your team, and team can see the data or the records obviously in the real time. So another tool which we have is the electronic lab notebook. It's a simple digital version of the normal lab notebook, but what we offer you a functionality for both chemist and biologist at the same canvas. So chemist can draw the chemical reaction, they can have the stoichiometric table easily, automatically, but biologists, they can also draw the biological entities. Also, they can register directly via these tools. We have the linking, attachment, etc. These tools, they help you to link different type of entities. For example, if you're purifying a protein and you have a DNA, you have a cell line, you can connect all those things together. We also have some Microsoft Office integrated, so you can visualize and analyze and even edit and save your Microsoft Office file automatically. What we have is also, let me just skip some part of this. So you can actually view the PDB viewer, so you can see the PDB files. You have the PDF viewer as well, image viewer as well, so you can visualize, edit the images as well. So there is an editing tool where you can edit the images. Maybe some sort of video will display, but if you want a thorough description, I can give a demonstration at the booth. Next slide is representing the smart way of any biological assay. So sometimes we lose the variables here and there when we are recording the data, but what CDD helps you to annotate your assays where you can actually record these variables and constant in a smart way. You can lock the values, and you can actually capture these things not only at the protocol level, at the run level as well. So there are some descriptions in the data, metadata fields. You can actually capture those metadata fields at the assay. Once you have these assay annotated, you can either pull them via the ontology, or you can create your own at CDD Vault, but it helps you to describe your assays very well. Each and every assay will get their own fingerprint. Visualization helps you to actually plot, filter, and mine entire database. So once you have your library and you have the biological assay, chemical assay, and properties around those things, then you would like to do the SAR analysis or maybe some cluster algorithm. R group decomposition is also there, and 2D, 3D scatter plot, maybe some histogram, bar chart, etc. Those things are here, which you can actually use to analyze your data set. And then we have this AI tool, which helps you to do design new drugs, explore chemical space, maybe find some similarity score, etc. And that helps you for obviously to explore new and design new molecules. And the last bit is our new parser system, which helps you to connect different instruments. So whatever you have in the lab, you can connect to this CDD Vault via the API script, and data will go automatically into your database, so you don't need to worry about even manual upload. And so lastly, what I would like to say, yes, you can have your fair quality data via this secure system using CDD Vault. And if you need or have any question, then please come to the booth. You can find me or my colleagues there. Thank you.